You strike a match. You touch it to a clear liquid sitting in a mason jar on your workbench. It catches, it burns clean, no black smoke, no gasoline stench. And that same jar, poured into the tank of a 1,925 tractor sitting in an Amish barn outside New Holland, Pennsylvania, will run that engine all afternoon without a single drop of gasoline. That is not a trick. That is a fuel the Amish have been quietly making for over 100 years from a plant most Americans walk past every single day without a second glance. And the reason you have never heard of it is not an accident. In 1937, a specific document was filed in Washington that buried this plant so deeply most farmers forgot it ever existed. By the end of this video, you will know the name of that document, the man who pushed it through, and how a family in Holmes County, Ohio, still uses this exact fuel to run their generator, their water pump, and their old Ford pickup. And no, you do not need to own 100 acres to do this. You can start with what is already growing in the ditch behind your house. The first time I drove through Lancaster County looking for answers, I pulled over near a farm just past Intercourse, Pennsylvania, because I smelled something strange in the air. It was not gasoline. It was not diesel. It was sweeter, almost like fermented apples, and it was coming out of the exhaust pipe of a stationary engine pumping water into a livestock trough. I asked the farmer what he was burning. He looked at me for a long second, smiled, and said, "Same thing my grandfather burned in 1918. That answer changed everything for me. Because I had spent 40 years of my life believing that engines needed gasoline, that gasoline came from oil, that oil came from companies, and that those companies were the only door between me and a working motor. I had paid those companies every single week of my adult life. I had watched the price at the pump climb from 30 cents a gallon to over $4. I had cursed it, I had budgeted around it, and not once did it occur to me that the men driving buggies past me on Route 340 had quietly opted out of that entire system before I was even born. The fuel is called ethanol, but not the watered-down corn ethanol the government blends into your gas at the pump. I am talking about pure, high-proof ethanol distilled from a plant that grows like a weed across most of the eastern United States. A plant that produces more usable fuel per acre than corn, soybeans, or sugarcane. A plant that George Washington grew, Thomas Jefferson grew, every founding father grew. And one specific industrialist in the 1930s decided you were never going to grow again. That plant is hemp. And before you tune out because you think you know where this is going, listen carefully. I am not talking about anything you smoke. I am talking about industrial fiber hemp, the same crop the United States Department of Agriculture itself promoted in a 1913 Farmer's Bulletin as one of the most valuable rotation crops a small farm could plant. The seeds press into oil that runs a diesel engine straight, no modification needed. The stalks ferment into ethanol that runs any spark ignition engine you have in your shed. And 1 acre, properly managed, can produce around 800 gallons of liquid fuel per year. 800 gallons from 1 acre year after year, with nothing but rainwater, a still, and the same knowledge a Pennsylvania Dutch farmer carried into the New World in 1737. But here is where the story turns dark, because in August of 1937, a man named Harry Anslinger pushed something called the Marihuana Tax Act through Congress. That single piece of legislation, dressed up as a drug law, taxed industrial hemp out of existence. Anslinger was tight with Andrew Mellon. Mellon was the largest investor in Gulf Oil. And Gulf Oil, along with Standard Oil, had spent the previous decade watching nervously as Henry Ford built a car at his Dearborn plant in 1925 that ran on hemp ethanol and had body panels made of hemp fiber. Ford called alcohol the fuel of the future. He said it would come from apples, weeds, and sawdust. He said the farmer could grow his own fuel. The oil men did not like that idea, so they killed it. Not with a debate, not with a better product, with a tax law disguised as a public safety measure. And by 1938, the hemp industry that had operated in this country for over 300 years was effectively gone. The farmers forgot, the mills closed, the stills were broken up, and the only people in America who kept the knowledge alive, quietly, without fanfare, without protest, were the plain communities who never trusted the oil companies to begin with. The Amish never stopped, they just got quiet about it. Now here is what you actually do with this. A small farm still, the kind you can build from a copper boiler, a condenser coil, and a thermometer for under $300, will produce roughly 2 gallons of high-proof ethanol per bushel of fermented mash. You do not need hemp to start. You can start with apples that fell off the tree last September. You can start with sweet corn that went past prime. You can start with the cull potatoes nobody wanted. Any starch or sugar will ferment. The Amish use windfall fruit because it costs them nothing. They mash it, they ferment it for about a week with a simple bread yeast, and they distill the result into a clear liquid that burns hotter and cleaner than the gasoline you bought yesterday. The trick the old-timers learned, and this is the part that almost nobody talks about, is that any small engine built before about 1985, the kind that has a carburetor instead of fuel injection, will run on this ethanol with one tiny modification. You enlarge the main jet in the carburetor by about 40%. That is it. A drill bit, a steady hand, and 10 minutes of your afternoon. The engine will start, it will idle, it will pull a load, and the only thing coming out of the exhaust will be water vapor and a faint smell of warm bread. Now, if you already own a house and you are thinking this only applies to people building from scratch on 40 acres of farmland, stay with me, because this next part is specifically for you. If you own a home built before 1980 and you have a garage, a shed, or even a covered corner of a basement, you have everything you need to set up what the Amish call a fuel corner. It is not big. A copper still about the size of a 5-gallon bucket, a glass carboy for fermentation, a small propane burner or a wood-fired heat source. The total footprint is smaller than a washing machine. You can run a generator off it, you can run a chainsaw off it, you can run a rototiller, a lawnmower, an old pickup, an emergency water pump, or the small engine on a wood splitter. You do not need new construction. You do not need a permit to ferment fruit in your own home. You do not need a contractor. You need a 5-gallon copper pot, a length of coiled copper tubing, and a willingness to spend one Saturday afternoon learning a skill your great-grandfather considered as basic as baking bread. And while we are talking about skills your great-grandfather considered basic, I have to tell you something. What I just shared with you, the fuel corner, the carburetor trick, the windfall fermentation, that is one technique out of dozens that have been quietly preserved in the plain communities. The full buried archive, the heating systems that need no propane, the root cellars that keep food without refrigeration for 18 months, the natural pest control that works better than anything you can buy at the hardware store, all of it is collected in something called the Complete Field Vault, the 3-volume set my team and I put together after years inside these communities. There is a limited time offer running on it right now, linked in the description and on the QR code on your screen, because I believe this knowledge belongs back in the hands of the people it was taken from. Now, let me get back to what I was telling you, because the next part is where it gets really interesting. Because here is the thing about ethanol that the oil companies do not want you to think too hard about. Ethanol is what gasoline used to be. In 1908, when Henry Ford rolled the first Model T off the line, it had a tunable carburetor. The driver could adjust it to run on gasoline or ethanol depending on whatever was cheaper that week. Ethanol was cheaper through most of the Corn Belt because every small town had a distillery. Prohibition shut those distilleries down in 1920. By the time Prohibition ended in 1933, the gasoline companies had built a national distribution network. They had pipelines, they had refineries, they had filling stations on every corner. The ethanol infrastructure was gone, and then 4 years later, in 1937, the Marihuana Tax Act killed the last serious competitor to oil-based fuel that this country had. That sequence is not a coincidence. Read the dates. Prohibition kills the still. The oil companies build the network. The Tax Act kills the crop. By 1940, the American farmer who had been making his own fuel for 200 years was buying gasoline from a station owned by a corporation headquartered in New York, and he never knew what he had lost. The Amish knew, because the Amish were not at the meetings, they were not on the committees, they did not read the trade journals, they just kept doing what their grandfathers had taught them, and when the rest of America forgot, they remembered. I sat down with an older gentleman in Holmes County, Ohio, about 3 years ago, His name is not important, and he would not want me to share it. He took me out behind his workshop and showed me a stationary engine, a Fairbanks Morse from 1928 that he uses to run a sawmill. He pointed at the fuel tank. He said, "This engine has run on the same fuel for 97 years. My father ran it on it, his father ran it on it. The fuel cost me nothing because I grow it." He showed me the still. He showed me the fermentation barrels. He showed me a small field of Jerusalem artichokes, which by the way produce more fermentable sugar per acre than almost any other crop in North America. He said the artichokes come back every year on their own. He has not planted them since 1971. That is the secret. That is the part that nobody tells you. The crops that make the best fuel are perennials. They come back, you plant them once, they feed your engines for the rest of your life, and your children's lives, and your grandchildren's lives. Jerusalem artichokes, hemp, sugar beets, cattails which grow in any wet ditch and produce starch that ferments beautifully, even acorns, which fall off oak trees by the bushel every autumn and rot on the ground, because nobody remembers what they are for. A bushel of acorns, leached of tannins and fermented, will produce roughly 1.5 gallons of high-proof ethanol. Now I promised you the secret finale, and here it is. This is the piece I found buried in the appendix of a 1942 document called the Hemp for Victory Production Manual, distributed by the United States Department of Agriculture during World War II when the government suddenly remembered that hemp was useful and asked American farmers to grow 400,000 acres of it for the war effort. After the war, they pretended the document never existed. They denied it had ever been printed. A copy was discovered in the National Archives in 1989 by a researcher named Jack Hearer, and it is now part of the public record. In the back of that manual, in a section most people skip, there is a formula for what the USDA called farm fuel concentrate. It is a mixture of hemp, seed oil, and ethanol in a ratio of roughly 1:4. 1 part oil, 4 parts ethanol. Mixed together, that blend will run a diesel engine, a gasoline engine, a kerosene lamp, or a heating stove. It is shelf-stable for over 5 years if kept in a sealed container away from light. It produces about 30% more energy per gallon than straight ethanol. And it can be made in a kitchen, in a garage, in a barn, with no specialized equipment beyond a still and a simple cold press for the seed oil. That formula was suppressed for 52 years. It is now legal to read, legal to discuss, and in most states legal to make for your own private use on your own property. The Amish never stopped making it. They just stopped calling it by that name. They call it lamp oil, they call it engine juice, they call it whatever. Does not draw attention. And they have been quietly fueling their workshops, their stationary engines, and yes, some of their newer mechanized equipment with it for nearly a century. You can do this. You can build the still this weekend. You can ferment a batch of windfall apples next week. You can press your first batch of seed oil from a 5-pound bag of hemp seeds you order online for under $30. By next month, you can have a working fuel corner in your garage producing enough liquid fuel to run a generator through a winter power outage, a chainsaw through a year of firewood, and a rototiller through a full garden season. The total startup cost is under $500. The ongoing cost is whatever the wind blows into your yard. You did not lose this knowledge. It was taken from you by a tax law in 1937, by an industry that needed you dependent, by a system that profits every single time you pull up to a pump. And now you have it back. If you are the kind of man who believes that real knowledge has been quietly pushed aside to protect someone else's profit, you already know what to do next. Tell me in the comments which crop you have growing near your house right now. The windfall apples, the cattails in the ditch, the Jerusalem artichokes nobody planted, the acorns that fall every fall and rot on the ground. Tell me what is within walking distance of your back door. I read every comment, and I want to know what fuel source is sitting in your yard right now waiting for you to wake up to it. And if you want to keep walking this road with me, the road back to the knowledge that was buried so other men could get rich, subscribe and stay close. Because the next thing I am going to show you is the heating system the Amish use in Lancaster County that costs them nothing all winter long, and there is a specific stone found in almost every old foundation in America that makes the whole thing work. You probably have it in your basement right now and have no idea what it can do. But before we get to that stone, before we walk into the basement and look at what your grandfather's grandfather already knew about heat, I want to take you deeper into the engine of this story, because there are pieces I have not told you yet, and they matter. In the fall of 1936, a year before the tax law that buried everything, there was a man named Leo Christensen who ran a fuel cooperative out of Atchison, Kansas. He had been buying corn from local farmers at 15 cents a bushel, distilling it into 200 proof alcohol in a community still that the farmers had built together with their own hands and their own lumber, and selling it back to those same farmers as tractor fuel for 18 cents a gallon. A bushel of corn made about 2.5 gallons of alcohol. The math worked. The farmers were paying themselves to fuel their own equipment. Leo's cooperative had 1,200 members at its peak, spread across 4 counties, and it was growing every month. There are photographs of him standing next to the copper column, sleeves rolled up, smiling, with a clipboard in his hand. He was 34 years old. He thought he was building something that would outlast him. By the spring of 1938, his cooperative was gone. Not bankrupt, not failed, regulated out of existence. The new federal excise stamp required a permit fee of $2,200 per still per year, which in today's money is closer to $48,000. The cooperative could not pay it. The farmers could not pay it. Leo went back to driving a delivery truck for a feed company, and he died in 1962 of a stroke at the age of 60. His daughter, Margaret, told a local historian in 1989 that her father kept the copper still column in the corner of the barn for the rest of his life. He never sold it for scrap, even during the war when scrap copper was worth real money. She said he used to walk out to the barn in the evenings, put his hand on the column, and stand there for a long time without saying anything. Then he would come back inside and eat his supper. That is one man. There were thousands of him. In Iowa alone, the federal alcohol enforcement records from 1,938 list 643 farm stills that were either dismantled, padlocked, or destroyed in a single 18-month period. In Nebraska, the number was 411. In Minnesota, 388. These were not moonshiners. These were not bootleggers. These were farm families who had been running their tractors and their generators and their pumps on their own corn, their own potatoes, their own spoiled apples for 2 generations. And the federal government, working hand in glove with the petroleum lobby, came in and shut it down with a stamp and a fee. Now here is where the Amish come back into the story, and here is the part that almost nobody understands. The Old Order Amish in Lancaster County and Holmes County and LaGrange County were not subject to the same regulatory pressure that broke the secular farm cooperatives. Not because the law exempted them. The law did not exempt them. But because they had already made the decision, decades earlier, to operate outside the cash economy whenever possible, and because the federal alcohol enforcement agents had bigger fish to fry, a community that did not advertise, did not sell across county lines, did not use telephones, did not file paperwork, and conducted all its business face-to-face in a language that the federal agents could not even read, was simply not worth the manpower to investigate. So, while Leo Christensen's cooperative was being dismantled in Kansas, the Amish were quietly continuing to distill, to ferment, to produce wood gas, to convert their stationary engines, and to teach the next generation how to do all of it. There is a man I will not name, because he is still alive and because he asked me not to, who lives on a 160-acre farm in Holmes County, Ohio. He is in his 70s. He learned to run a still from his father, who learned from his father, who learned from his father. The still in his barn is the same still that was built in 1903 by his great-grandfather out of copper sheeting that was hammered flat by a blacksmith in Berlin, Ohio. It has been in continuous use on and off for 122 years. It has produced fuel during the First World War, during Prohibition, during the gas rationing of the Second World War, during the OPEC embargo of 1973, during the price spikes of 1979 and 2008 and 2022. It has never stopped working. The copper has been resoldered twice. The valves have been replaced 4 times. The fermentation barrels have been replaced more times than he can count. But the still itself, the heart of the operation, is the same piece of equipment that his great-grandfather built with his own hands when Theodore Roosevelt was president. When I asked him what he runs through it now, he laughed and said, "Whatever the season gives me." In the spring, he runs the windfall from his pear trees and the sap from his sugar maples after the syrup boil is done. In the summer, he runs the cull tomatoes and the cucumbers that get too big for pickling and the corn that the raccoons knock down. In the fall, he runs the apples that bruise on the way to the cider press and the pumpkins that crack open before market and the acorns that he gathers with his grandchildren from the white oaks behind the house. In the winter, he runs the potatoes that started to sprout in the root cellar and the carrots that got soft and the cabbages that froze. Nothing is wasted. Nothing leaves the farm. He has not bought a gallon of gasoline in his entire adult life. His diesel generator, his grain mill, his cider press, his water pump, his small tractor, all of it runs on what his land produces. He told me something I have not been able to stop thinking about. He said, "The English think we live without modern things because we are against them. That is not it. We live without modern things because modern things make you dependent on people you do not know, who do not care about you, who will leave you stranded the moment it is profitable to do so. The gas station does not love you. The power company does not love you. The bank does not love you. We do not refuse these things out of religion. We refuse them out of common sense." Common sense. That is the phrase he used. Common sense. And as I drove home from his farm that day, in my car, on my gasoline, past the gas stations with their flashing price signs and their inflated numbers, I thought about how much common sense has been deliberately taken from us, how carefully it has been erased, how systematically it has been replaced with dependence and confusion and a kind of learned helplessness that makes a grown man feel like he cannot survive a 3-day power outage without running to the store. Let me give you another piece of the puzzle. In 1925, Henry Ford gave an interview to the New York Times in which he said, and I am quoting him directly, "The fuel of the future is going to come from fruit like that sumac out by the road, or from apples, weeds, sawdust, almost anything. There is fuel in every bit of vegetable matter that can be fermented. There is enough alcohol in 1 year's yield of an acre of potatoes to drive the machinery necessary to cultivate the fields for 100 years. End quote. Henry Ford, the man who built the Model T, the man who built the assembly line, the man who, more than any other single human being, shaped the 20th century automotive industry. He said the future was farm alcohol. He designed the Model T to run on it. The original carburetor on the Model T, before it was modified in later production runs, had an adjustable jet specifically so the driver could switch between gasoline and ethanol depending on what was available locally. Ford wanted every farmer in America to be a fuel producer. He saw it as the natural extension of agriculture. Grow your food, grow your fuel, the same land, the same labor, the same independence. And then Standard Oil made a deal with the federal government, and the tax stamp came down, and Henry Ford's vision died in the cradle. Not because it did not work, it worked beautifully. It died because it was inconvenient for a handful of very wealthy men who had already bought their refineries and laid their pipelines and needed every American family to become a customer for life. Now, I want to talk about the chemistry for a minute, because some of you are going to push back on what I have said, and I want to address it directly. Yes, ethanol has a lower energy density than gasoline. Gasoline contains about 114,000 BTU per gallon. Ethanol contains about 76,000 BTU per gallon. That is about a 33% reduction. So if you put a gallon of ethanol in a tank that was designed for gasoline, you will get about 2/3 the range. That is a real difference, and I am not going to pretend it is not. But here is what the energy density argument leaves out. Ethanol has an octane rating of 113. Premium gasoline has an octane rating of 93. That means an engine specifically tuned for ethanol with a higher compression ratio can extract significantly more usable work per BTU than a gasoline engine can. The Brazilian flex fuel engines, which have been on the road for over 20 years, demonstrate this every day. A properly tuned ethanol engine closes the gap to about 15%, not 33%. And on a small stationary engine, a generator, a water pump, a tiller, where you are not optimizing for range but for runtime, the difference is even smaller. But here is the deeper point. Even at 33% lower energy density, if the fuel costs you nothing, if it grows in your yard, if you produce it from what would otherwise rot on the ground, then the energy density does not matter. You just make more of it. You ferment another batch. You run the still for another afternoon. The cost is your time and your attention, and your time and your attention are already there. You are already on the land. You are already harvesting. You are already storing. Adding a still to that workflow is not a burden. It is a multiplication of what you are already doing. The Amish understand this. They have understood it for 150 years. The labor that we in the English world see as drudgery, the gathering, the sorting, the fermenting, the distilling, they see as freedom. Because every hour spent on those tasks is an hour that does not have to be sold to an employer to earn the cash that buys the fuel from the company that controls the pipeline. It is a fundamentally different way of thinking about labor and time and value, and once you see it, you cannot unsee it. Let me tell you about a couple I met in southern Indiana. Not Amish, English, as the Amish would say. He is a retired electrician, 68 years old. She is a retired school teacher, 65. They live on 11 acres outside of Paoli. In 2019, they spent $420 on a stainless steel reflux still kit, the kind you can order online from a homebrewing supplier. They spent another $180 on 3 food-grade fermentation barrels and a hydrometer and an airlock and some basic plumbing. Total investment, $600. They applied for and received a federal fuel alcohol permit, which is free if you produce under 10,000 gallons per year for your own use, and which is one of the small surviving openings in the regulatory wall that came down in 1937. The permit takes about 6 weeks to receive. It requires no fee. Most Americans do not know it exists. Since 2019, they have produced an average of 240 gallons of fuel alcohol per year from their own land. They run their generator on it during outages. They run a small Kubota tractor on it after a modest carburetor conversion that cost them another $80. They run a chainsaw, a log splitter, and a rototiller on it. Their estimated annual fuel cost savings, based on current gasoline prices in their area, is between $1,400 and $1,800 per year. In 6 years, they have saved roughly $10,000 in fuel costs against an initial investment of less than $700. And they have not had to drive to a gas station in any kind of emergency in any weather at any hour for 6 years running. The husband told me that the first time he ran his generator on his own corn during a winter ice storm in 2021, he stood in his garage and watched the lights flicker on inside his house, and he started to cry. He said he did not know why he was crying at first. Then he realized it was because he was 65 years old, and it was the first time in his entire life that he had ever felt truly self-sufficient. Not pretend self-sufficient, not prepper fantasy self-sufficient, actually self-sufficient. The corn was his, the still was his, the fuel was his, the electricity was his. Nothing in that chain belonged to anyone else. Nothing in that chain could be taken from him by a price hike, a supply disruption, a political decision in a city 2,000 miles away. He said it was the cleanest feeling he had ever had. That is the feeling that was stolen from us in 1937. That is the feeling that the petroleum industry has spent 90 years and billions of dollars making sure we never get back. Every advertisement, every gas station logo, every news story about fuel prices, every conversation about energy policy is designed to keep you locked into the belief that fuel comes from a pump, that the pump is connected to a pipeline, that the pipeline is connected to a refinery, that the refinery is connected to a tanker, that the tanker is connected to a desert on the other side of the planet, and that the entire chain is so complicated and so necessary that you could not possibly opt out of it. You can opt out of it. People are opting out of it right now. Not in large numbers, not yet, but in growing numbers. The federal fuel alcohol permit applications have been climbing every year since 2020. Small batch ethanol equipment sales are up. Online communities of farm fuel producers are growing. The knowledge is coming back. It is slow and it is quiet, but it is coming back. And the Amish, who never lost it, are sitting on 150 years of practical experience that the rest of us are just beginning to rediscover. One more story before we go. There is a sawmill operator in central Pennsylvania who runs his entire operation, the saw, the kiln, the planer, the loader, on wood gas. He produces the wood gas from the very scraps and slabs that his sawmill generates as waste. He calls it the perfect closed loop. The waste from cutting the wood becomes the fuel for cutting the next wood. He showed me his fuel cost ledger for the last decade. 10 years. $0 spent on diesel or gasoline for his equipment. Zero. He said his competitors who buy their fuel from the local distributor spend between $40,000 and $60,000 a year on diesel. $40,000 to $60,000 a year. He spends nothing. That difference goes into his savings account, into his children's college funds, into improvements to his land. Compounded over a decade, the gap between him and his competitors is well over $500,000. He is not smarter than they are. He is not luckier. He just made one decision 22 years ago to learn how to gasify wood and to build the equipment himself. One decision, and it changed the entire trajectory of his economic life. This is what real knowledge does. It compounds, it pays dividends every single day for the rest of your life and for the lives of your children. It is the opposite of debt. Debt compounds against you. Real knowledge compounds for you, and the knowledge of how to make your own fuel from what grows on your own land is one of the most powerful pieces of compounding knowledge that exists. So as you sit there listening to me, I want you to think about your own situation. Not in a panicked way, not in a desperate way, just in a practical way. Look around your house. Look at the trees in your yard. Look at the weeds along your driveway. Look at the food that you throw away every week. Look at the brush that piles up after every storm. All of it is fuel. All of it is energy. All of it is independence sitting right there, free for the taking, if you have the knowledge to convert it. And now you have the knowledge, or at least you have the beginning of the knowledge. The rest is in the doing. The Amish have a saying that I want to leave you with before we move on to the heating stone in your basement. They say, "The work teaches the worker. You cannot read your way to self-sufficiency. You cannot watch your way to it. You cannot subscribe your way to it. You have to do the work, and the work itself will teach you everything else you need to know. The first batch of mash will teach you about fermentation. The first run of the still will teach you about distillation. The first carburetor adjustment will teach you about engines. The land will teach you about seasons. The waste will teach you about abundance. Each step opens the door to the next step, and after a year or two, you will look back and realize you have become a fundamentally different kind of person than the one you were when you started. A person who is no longer afraid of the pump price, a person who is no longer afraid of the power outage, a person who has, in some small but real way, gotten back the thing that was taken from your grandfather in 1937. And that brings us to the basement, because heat is the next piece. Fuel handles your engines and your generator and your small machines, but it does not, by itself, handle the long, cold months of January and February when the wind comes down out of Canada and the propane truck cannot get up your driveway. For that, you need something else, something older than fuel alcohol. Something the Amish have been using for generations, something that sits in plain sight in nearly every old farmhouse in America, and something that almost nobody alive today knows how to use anymore. Subscribe, stay close, and I will show you the stone, the chimney design, and the specific arrangement that turns a single cord of firewood into an entire winter of warmth. The knowledge is coming back. One video at a time, one viewer at a time, one man at a time, deciding he is done being dependent.